want to show you a couple of techniques to create texture in watercolor. One of them is using salt. You can use any kind of salt. This is just regular table salt. The salt is going to absorb some of the color, so you want to use nice and rich color for this. And I'm not going to make a smooth wash for this. Instead, I will just have different colors. So here I'm using purples and greens, and as I mentioned, I'm just going to play a little bit by dropping in bits of color in different places. And now that I have plenty of water on this paper, I'm just kind of dropping the color straight in. Now, before my color dries, because it's really important to do it while it is still wet, I'm going to use some salt and just sprinkle some salt. I'm putting quite generously on there. And you're going to see, because some of the areas were already drying, so you're going to see the difference in the texture in the areas that were wet and the areas that were dry. Once you put the salt on, you don't want to touch your painting anymore, and you just want to let it dry as is, and then I will show it to you once it dries. So now the salt has dried, or the wash with the salt has dried, so you just have to rub the salt off like this and just shake it off to get all the salt off. And I will show you up close at the texture that it creates. You can see how it eats out some of the colors, especially the areas that were more wet. You can see in the areas that are dry, the salt didn't really do anything. So just in the wet areas, it created some interesting, beautiful kind of underwater textures. So in this one, I'm going to show you how to use some saran wrap, just your regular cling wrap that you would get at a grocery store, to create some interesting textures as well. And I'm using some of these beautiful colors that I have in my watercolor palette that apparently I don't use that much because those jars are still full, but I'm discovering some really beautiful pigments. Again, I'm not making a perfect wash because I want the color to still be wet when we put the saran wrap on. I'm simply going to take a small piece of saran wrap, or medium-sized piece of saran wrap, and you can kind of scrunch it up however you want the texture to be, and you simply put it on and press it. And you can kind of see underneath there, I'll lift a little bit, you could kind of see the kind of texture that is starting to happen. It's going to look really cool. So I'm going to use another piece. And, you know, again, the way that you fold it is going to determine what kind of, you know, whether you're going to get lots of those little geometric shapes or just a few. There. So I've placed it down. Now you want to let it dry, and when it dries, we'll lift it up and I'll show it to you. So this color is almost dry, and I'm going to lift off the saran wrap to show you the texture. This one is not dry completely, so you could see both when it's dry and partially dry. So it creates quite beautiful textures if you were to do rocks or ice mountains or anything like that. It would be interesting. Also, you can do this in layers. So now that this is dry, you can put another layer of color and repeat the process so that you can have this beautiful texture. So in this one, I'm going to show you how you can lift watercolor once you have painted it onto your paper. You could see I'm not a terribly neat painter. I like to be a little bit messy. And to lift watercolor, you want to get all the color off of your brush and all the water off your brush so that your brush is kind of dry. And you can come in and you could see how easily it's almost like, you know, I'm drawing into it with another, you can do it fully, you know, you can lift the color fully or partially. So you need to do this while the color is wet. However, if your color has already dried, you can also lift it by just simply re-wetting it again. I am lifting pretty much to the white of, sometimes people are so worried about making a mistake in watercolor. And I want you to know that you can come back and lift areas and repaint them again. You can also use another material to absorb some of the color. So this is paper towel folded up. You can use tissue paper, you can use all kinds of materials. Some of the color is transferring onto it as well. And depending how long kind of I hold it, that's how much color I remove. So you can just remove a little bit just to create some texture, or you can remove a lot. So if you need to lift really small areas, sometimes using a flat brush like this that's a little bit more has a little bit more spring to it, so you can press into it, is really helpful. So I wetted the brush because some of those areas have dried already, but you could see how I can remove color and create different textures just by adding a little bit of water and then drying my brush and lifting it off. It's kind of soft edges when you lift watercolor, so it's a beautiful way to create some atmospheric effects, to lift up some highlights, to create textures, or even, as I mentioned, if you need to change part of the painting, if something didn't quite go as you wanted to, you can lift it up. You can also use a sponge, and you can just wet a sponge and practically wash off, this is a wet sponge, wash off a section of your painting. Now some colors, I put down very dark pigment as you saw, so some colors will sort of stain the paper a bit, so you could see that in this instance, right? You could see a little bit of the staining. However, I lifted quite a lot of color, so I can come back and add more color to it if I wanted to. It's also kind of an interesting way to lighten an area if you just wanted to kind of lighten it up. It's also an interesting way is to use a sponge. You can also use the edge of the sponge just to lift parts or sections. It's a really cool material, and it'll allow you to loosen up a little bit. Another material to create texture in watercolor is alcohol. You can just buy any kind of rubbing alcohol, and you can use different things to apply it with. So using some sienna with some greens this time. Because I'm creating textures, you can see I'm not as concerned about my drips or irregularities in my wash or unevenness. I actually like it for the textures. So you can put alcohol into like a little spray bottle and just spray it on. Right. See the spray working? Ooh, too much. There we go. There we go. That's better. So that's from the spray bottle. You can also use a dropper. So it sort of takes out some of the color and creates this a circle within a circle kind of form. So again, this is salt, the salt texture. This is alcohol with the spray bottle, and with the dropper. This right here, it was saran wrap. And this we're creating just by lifting some of the color using paper towel as well as using a brush.